Oh, like what?
Well, in the US, restroom is the most common term.
Okay.
But in the UK and other parts of the world, people often say toilet.
That's good to know. Being aware of those regional differences can prevent a lot of awkwardness.
It can. And the podcast stresses that politeness is key when you're asking this question.
Of course.
Starting with, excuse me, shows respect and sets the right tone.
So, excuse me, where's the restroom? Is a safe bet in most situations.
Yes. And of course, once you've been directed to the facilities, don't forget to say thank you. Always. It's just a little gesture that shows your appreciation. It does. Okay, I think we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. From greetings and apologies to asking for help and finding the restroom.
We have?
We've explored all kinds of essential phrases that can help you navigate everyday conversations with more confidence and grace.
And it's amazing how much power these simple phrases have. You know, when used effectively, they can build rapport, smooth over awkwardness, and even open doors to deeper connections.
It's like having a secret decoder ring for understanding the complexities of human communication.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And speaking of decoding, it really highlights how language is about so much more than just, the words themselves.
Yeah.
It's about understanding all those little cues and the social dynamics that kind of shape our interactions.
Absolutely. Like having a secret decoder ring for navigating those complex human interactions.
I love that. And speaking of decoding,
Yeah.
let's talk about a phrase that's super important for anyone learning a new language or even just trying to understand complicated topics.
I don't understand.
Ah, yes.
Yes.
That phrase that can make any language learner's heart skip a beat.
Right.
I remember feeling so self-conscious about admitting I didn't understand something when I was first starting out.
It's such a common feeling, but the podcast we're talking about today actually flips the script on that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It emphasizes how saying I don't understand can actually be a sign of strength. It shows that you're dedicated to learning.
Interesting.
It's about recognizing that you're on a journey and it's okay to not have all the answers right away.
I like that.
And it also signals to the other person that you're really engaged in the conversation.
Right.
You actually want to understand their perspective.
Now, the podcast does acknowledge that sometimes just blurting out I don't understand can sound a bit harsh.
Yeah, it can.
So it offers some alternative phrases
Okay.
that might feel a little softer or less confrontational.
Like what?
You can try, I'm not sure I follow, or I don't quite get it.
Those do sound a bit less direct.
Right. And if you need even more clarification, you can always follow up with a specific question. Like, could you explain that again? Or can you give me an example?
Those are good ones. It shows that you're really making an effort to grasp the concept.
Exactly. Now let's flip the scenario for a second. What advice does the podcast give for those times when someone else tells you they don't understand something you've said?
That's where patience and empathy are so important.
For sure.
It's about remembering that not everyone learns at the same pace or in the same way.
That's a good reminder.
The key is to be willing to adjust how you're communicating to meet their needs.
Okay.
Maybe they need a simpler explanation or a different example, or even something visual to help them understand.
Right. It's about meeting them where they are and helping them get to that point of understanding.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about greetings, apologies, asking for help, and those I don't understand moments.
We have.
But let's shift gears now and talk about a phrase that's essential for navigating social situations smoothly, especially when you need to politely interrupt someone.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Yes. Excuse me. The magic phrase that can prevent so many awkward encounters.
It's true. We touched on it briefly before when we were talking about asking for directions.
Right.
But it's useful in so many other situations too.
Give me some examples.
Like if you need to get someone's attention,
Okay.
a simple excuse me can do the trick without sounding too abrupt or demanding.
That's true.
Or if you need to interrupt someone politely, like if they're in the middle of a conversation,
Right.
you could say, excuse me, may I interrupt for a moment? It shows that you respect their time and that you're asking for their attention.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
And of course, excuse me is indispensable when you're trying to get through a crowded place.
Oh, absolutely.
Just saying, excuse me, as you squeeze past someone can prevent those accidental bumps and collisions.
You can. And it turns what could be an annoying situation into a moment of shared courtesy.
The podcast also makes a good point about how your tone of voice and body language play a big role in how excuse me, is received.
They do.
Like using a friendly tone and a smile can make a huge difference.
It's about conveying that you're aware of the other person's space.
Right.
And that you're trying to be as considerate as possible.
So we've talked about excuse me, for those little social hiccups.
We have.
But what about when you need to apologize for something more serious? That's where I'm sorry comes in.
Right. And as we touched on before, sincerity is so important when you're apologizing.
It is.
It's about more than just saying the words.
Yeah.
It's about genuinely feeling remorse and taking responsibility for your actions.
Absolutely. And the podcast suggests that it can be helpful to give a reason for your apology,
Okay.
to add some context to your words. Like instead of just, I'm sorry I missed our meeting,
I see.
you could say, I'm sorry I missed our meeting. I had a family emergency come up.
Right. That shows that you're not just making excuses.
Exactly. You're taking responsibility.
And it helps the other person understand the situation.
Yeah. And in some cases, it might be appropriate to go even further and offer a solution or ask how you can make things right.
Like, I'm sorry I broke your vase. Can I replace it for you?
Exactly. It shows that you're truly remorseful and you want to make things better.
It's about going beyond words and taking action.
Now let's switch perspectives again.
Yeah.
How should you respond when someone apologizes to you?
Well, the podcast reminds us that a simple, that's okay, or no problem is often enough, especially if it was a minor offense.
But if the apology was for something more serious,
Right.
or if the relationship is really important to you,
I see.
you might want to give a more thoughtful response.
Okay.
Something like, I appreciate the apology, or thank you for saying that.
Those phrases can help to smooth things over and rebuild trust.
They can. It's about choosing a response that feels right for you and the situation.
Okay, so we talked about excuse me and I'm sorry.
Right.
Now, let's dive into a phrase that's all about making connections and creating those positive first impressions.
I'm listening.
Nice to meet you.
Ah, yes. The classic greeting for when you meet someone new.
It's so simple, yet so effective. It conveys that you're open and willing to connect.
But the podcast suggests some ways to take this standard greeting to the next level.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, instead of just nice to meet you, you could say, it's really nice to meet you, or I'm so pleased to meet you.
Those sound much warmer and more engaging.
Right. It's about going beyond that basic script and adding some genuine enthusiasm.
The podcast also reminds us that how we say it matters just as much as the words themselves.
Oh, for sure.
Like a genuine smile, a firm handshake, and good eye contact can really reinforce that message of nice to meet you.
Absolutely. It's all about creating that positive first impression.
It is. Now, what about when you're greeting someone you've met before?
Right. Like, this nice to see you again.
Yeah.
Really got it.
Well, nice to see you again is perfectly fine. But the podcast suggests some ways to make it sound less routine and more heartfelt.
Okay.
You could try something like, it's great to see you again, or it's so good to see you again.
I like those.
Yeah,
They sound more enthusiastic and personal.
they do. And it shows that you're acknowledging that shared history you have with the person,
Right.
making the interaction more meaningful.
The podcast also emphasizes how important it is to remember people's names.
It's true.
When you use someone's name, it shows that you've made an effort to remember them.
It does.
They're not just a random face in the crowd. Okay, so we've covered greetings for both new and familiar faces.
We have.
But let's shift gears now and talk about a phrase that's essential for handling everyday transactions.
Oh, okay.
Whether you're at a store, or a market, or even just ordering food.
Got it.
How much does this cost?
That's definitely a phrase everyone should know.
Especially when you're traveling or living in an English-speaking country.
It is. But I think a lot of people worry about sounding rude or awkward when they ask about prices.
Yeah, I can see that.
But the podcast has some great tips on how to ask this question politely and appropriately.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So instead of just blurting out, how much does this cost? You could say, what's the price of this? Or, can you tell me how much this is?
Those sound so much better.
Right. It's more polished and respectful.
It shows that you value their time and you're acknowledging their role in the transaction.
Exactly. Now let's say you find out the price and it's a little more than you wanted to spend.
Oh,
How do you politely decline without sounding rude?
that's a good question.
Well, the podcast suggests phrases like, that's a bit out of my price range, or I'll have to think about it.
Okay, those are good.
It acknowledges the price without sounding dismissive.
Right. And if you're happy with the price and ready to buy,
Then you can just say, I'll take it, or I'd like to buy this, please.
easy peasy.
It's all about using clear and concise language while still being polite and respectful.
Okay, so we've covered greetings, apologies, asking for help, and even handling transactions.
We have.
But there's one more essential phrase I want to revisit before we wrap up that section.
Okay.
Could you repeat that, please?
Yes. The phrase that can save you from so much awkwardness when you've missed something.
It's true. I think we've all been in those situations where we pretended to understand something,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
when in reality we were completely lost.
It happens.
But the podcast we're discussing really emphasizes that it's okay to ask someone to repeat themselves,
It is.
as long as you do it politely.
Oh.
And could you repeat that, please? Is such a straightforward and respectful way to do that.
It shows that you're engaged and you want to understand what's being said.
The podcast also gives some helpful variations,
Okay.
depending on the situation. Like if it's noisy, you can say, could you speak a little louder, please?
Right.
Or if the person is speaking too fast, you can ask, could you speak a little more slowly, please?
It's about adjusting your request to fit what's going on around you.
And the podcast makes a great point about what to do when someone asks you to repeat something.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
It's all about being patient and understanding.
Absolutely.
Communication is a two-way street.
Right.
Sometimes we need to put in that extra effort to make sure everyone is on the same page.
It's true.
It's about recognizing that not everyone processes information at the same speed,
Right.
and that sometimes repetition is needed for clarity.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's about being flexible and realizing that sometimes we need to adjust our approach to make sure everyone understands what we're saying.
Absolutely. It's like we're both working together, to make sure the message gets across.
Okay, so I think we've covered a ton of ground today.
We have.
From greetings and apologies to asking for help, clarifying things, and even navigating those everyday transactions.
It's pretty amazing how much we depend on these simple phrases
Right.
to get through those tricky social interactions.
And what I really appreciate about this podcast
Yeah.
is that it goes beyond just, listing the phrases. It digs into the nuances, like how these phrases actually work in different situations.
Right.
And it emphasizes things like tone of voice, body language, and even cultural sensitivity.
It's like we're getting a behind-the-scenes look at how to communicate effectively.
Exactly. We're seeing the mechanics behind the magic.
I like that. And realizing that even small changes can make a big difference in how we connect with others.
Speaking of connections,
Yeah.
let's go back to greetings for a second.
Okay.
We've talked about nice to meet you and nice to see you again.
Right.
But what about those times when you want to express something a bit warmer and more personal?
Ah, yes. Like when a standard greeting just doesn't quite cut it.
Exactly. So what does the podcast suggest for those situations?
I'm all ears.
Well, it encourages us to kind of go off script a little and use our own words to express warmth and connection.
Oh, okay.
Like instead of just, nice to see you again.
Right.
You could say, it's so wonderful to see you. Or I've been looking forward to seeing you again.
I like those. They sound so much more genuine and heartfelt.
Right. It shows that you're going beyond just the basic formalities.
And it reminds us that language is such a powerful tool for expressing our emotions and building relationships.
It's not just about sharing information. It's about creating those human connections.
For sure. And speaking of expressing emotions,
Yeah.
let's talk about a phrase that can be a little tricky for language learners,
Okay.
especially for people who come from cultures where expressing strong emotions isn't as common.
I see.
I'm sorry.
Ah, yes. The art of apologizing.
It can be really nuanced, and it definitely varies from culture to culture.
It does. The podcast offers some really good advice on how to apologize effectively in English.
Okay.
It stresses the importance of being sincere
Right.
and acknowledging how your actions affected the other person.
It's about going beyond just saying the words
Right.
and showing that you're really willing to make things right. And it can be helpful to explain why you're apologizing,
Oh, yeah.
to get some context. Like instead of, I'm sorry I missed our meeting,
Right.
you could say, I'm sorry I missed our meeting. I had a family emergency.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Adding that detail shows that you're not just making excuses.
Exactly. And in some situations, it might even be appropriate to go a step further and offer a solution or ask how you can fix things. Like, I'm sorry I spilled coffee on your shirt. Can I pay for the dry cleaning?
Or, I'm sorry I forgot your birthday. Can I take you out to dinner to make it up to you?
Those are good ones. Those gestures show that you're truly sorry and you want to repair the damage.
They go beyond just words.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we talk about how to apologize.
We have.
But what about when someone apologizes to you?
how should you respond?
The podcast says that a simple, that's okay, or no problem, is usually enough, especially if it was a small thing.
Okay.
But if the apology was for something more serious,
Right.
or if the relationship is important to you,
Yeah.
a more gracious response might be better.
Like what?
You could say, I appreciate the apology, or thank you for saying that.
Those are nice. They can help to smooth things over and show that you're willing to move on.
And sometimes the best response might be to just acknowledge the apology without words,
Oh, I see.
like with a nod or a gentle touch on the arm.
That can be really powerful. Sometimes actions speak louder than words.
They do. Okay, so we've explored a wide range of those essential English phrases today.
We have.
From greetings and apologies to asking for help, clearing up misunderstandings, and even expressing those warmer, more personal feelings.
It's amazing how much these phrases can impact our interactions and relationships.
And what I really love about this podcast is that it shows us how to go beyond just memorizing phrases. It encourages us to really understand the nuances of how they work in different situations.
Right. To be mindful of our tone and body language.
Exactly. And to always strive for that genuine connection with others.
It's about recognizing that language is so much more than just rules and vocabulary.
It is.
It's a dynamic tool for building bridges and fostering understanding.
And it's a journey of continuous learning.
It is.
As you become more comfortable with these essential phrases, you'll find yourself branching out, trying new things, and discovering your own unique voice.
So to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to embrace the challenge of mastering these phrases. They're not just words. They're keys that can open doors to new friendships, opportunities, and experiences.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, the most important thing in any conversation is to be yourself.
Be authentic.
Yes. Let your personality shine through. Be open to learning, and don't be afraid to make mistakes
That's how we grow.
and connect with each other. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into essential English phrases.
I hope everyone enjoyed it.
I did too. It was a great conversation. Thank you for listening to The Deep Dive.